I met Rochelle we had a training this summer on cultural competence, and I just really found that Rochelle is an excellent spokesperson and very committed to domestic violence issues and Native issues. And if you looked at her bio, you'll see how impressive it is. She works on several initiatives with the Native communities around research, and she currently working at the Albuquerque Area Indian Health Board as a research assistant. And she's also an expert on the ACE study, which we talk a lot about in the Coalition, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I think you'll be talking some about today. Is that right, Rochelle?
Yes, we will.
Yes. And also a mom with 2 kids, and an excellent mom at that, from what I can tell. You know how you can just tell.
Thank you, David.
So with that, I'll just thank you very much for doing this webinar, Rochelle, and I'll pass the floor over to you.
Okay. Well, before I begin the webinar, I want to thank the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the leading voice for ending domestic violence in New Mexico, for hosting this webinar. My name is Rochelle Tenorio, and I am from Santo Domingo Pueblo, also known as Giwa Pueblo. And today we will be talking about advocacy with Native people. And I'll be orienting domestic violence workers to the beliefs, values, and practices of Native people in New Mexico. So I want to go over the session objectives. We have a lot to cover, and the 10 main points that I want to make is to identify Native American populations in New Mexico. I want to review the Southwest historical timeline, discuss historical trauma and grief, identify how history has shaped who we are today, as well as identify Native beliefs, practices, and values. We will also identify disparities and barriers in Indian country. We'll define tribal sovereignty and review ways to advocate for the Native American client. We'll identify culturally appropriate strategies to work with Native communities, and I will discuss some recommendations and resources. Although this may seem like a lot to cover, I want to touch on each and every one of these objectives because they are all important in providing advocacy for Native clients. Some ground rules that I want to cover, which is simply to minimize distraction and background noise. You want to use the mute button. If you have it on, make sure it's set to mute so that we don't hear any of the background noise to prevent interruption. And every time you ask a question or you want to comment, which is highly encouraged, I want you to introduce yourself, mention your first name so that it makes it easier for us to follow the discussion. It's recommended that you don't use a mobile phone because the sound quality is much worse than landline. And participation again is highly welcome, and we welcome you to type in your comments, questions, and David talked about how you can do that. I will be integrating what's called a fast pass, body breaks, and end with an action plan. And I'll talk about that as I come across them. So before I begin, I want to implement what's called a fast pass. And I would like everyone to write one fact that you already know about the topic or a question that you would like to be answered. All questions, of course, will be covered at the end, time permitted, and you can ask them throughout the webinar as well. So we'll take a minute to go over that as I cover the next slide. So why are we here? Well, let me give you 4 reasons why we are here. The first reason is in 2006, an Alaska Native woman reported that she was raped by a non-Native man. She was informed that the police would investigate her case, but they never did. Due to the trauma of the situation, she was so shaken up, incoherent, and talking faster than usual. She was disheveled and bruised up, so when she went to the ER, they assumed she was drunk, and so she was treated as a drunken native first and a rape victim second. She was provided pain medication and money as she was directed to a shelter where she was promptly refused because they also assumed she was a drunk native. Reason number 2, her name is Della. Della was raped, mutilated, and murdered with her head bashed in, and as of today, no justice has been provided for her rape and murder. Ria is the 3rd reason. She was raped and severely beaten by 4 men, and to cope, she took an overdose of diabetic medication that she found in her assailant's home. She died 2 weeks after the rape case was closed and the assailants never caught. Lastly, in 2005, 2 similar cases in which Native women involved were raped by 3 men. To eliminate evidence, the men used condoms, women were blindfolded and required to take a bath after the rape. The DV workers who were assisting in the case could not establish where the incident took place because of the blindfold, so therefore they could not establish jurisdiction. Since jurisdiction could not be established, so could the justice for these women. These are just 4 reasons why we are holding this webinar, and I want you to think of that one Native woman whom you have worked with in the past that were in a similar situation. It is for these women that I dedicate this webinar to. Moving on to Objective 1, identifying Native American populations in New Mexico. This is our first poll. How many tribes, pueblos, nations are there in the United States? Go ahead and answer that question.
Okay, there. If I did it right, it just launched for everybody, so you can choose.
David, I can't see the polling results, so if you could tell me.
Okay, I'm just waiting for enough people to get there. So 12% say 400, 12% say 300, 56% say 583, and 19% say 562. So I'm going to close. Okay. Oh, and let's see. Oh, there you go. Can you see that?
No, I can't.
Oh, okay.
No, I can't.
This is the first time I've tried polls, so this is exciting. So most people said 583, 60%.
Okay, we'll see. So this is meant to be somewhat of a trick question. Notice that I did not ask how many federally recognized tribes versus state recognized tribes there are in the United States. Federally recognized tribes is an American Indian or Alaska Native tribal entity that is recognized as having a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. with responsibilities, powers, limitations, and obligations attached to that designation, and is also eligible for funding and services from the federal government programs. So in this question, I am referring to the federally recognized tribes in the United States. And according to the Federal Register, there are 562 federally recognized tribes. So that would be D. C is fairly close. And depending on whom you ask, whom the source is, sometimes they are higher and lower. So I just want to mention that. This is kind of a picture to demonstrate the different tribes that are seen throughout the United States. I'll be touching more about the sovereignty issue later on in my presentation. But I just want to mention that federal piece. I have another poll for you. So how many tribes, pueblos, and nations are considered to be a part of New Mexico? This isn't a trick question. You can answer that accordingly.
So 36% say 19, 30% say 20, 25% say 25, and 11% say 27. So
Okay.
the winner is 19.
Majority said E. Okay. And are we done with the polling?
Yes.
Okay. So that would be D, 25. And I'll be going into detail about who these tribes, pueblos, and nations are in New Mexico. Although I do not personally know too much about each culture, I recognize each as a sovereign entity, needing respectful acknowledgement as tribal pueblo nations communities as a part of New Mexico. And they are, so the 20 pueblos, Estado del Sur was a recent addition, and although they are located in Texas, they are a direct descendant from Estado Pueblo. And the 19 pueblos, as seen here, are all located in New Mexico. So they're spread throughout the state. There is also the Navajo Nation. They are one of the largest reservations in the entire United States. They consist of about 308,000 members, and this is according to the 2010 census. They also have chapters, which are local governments, and according to one of my sources, she mentioned that there are 88 chapters located in the Navajo Nation, and the chapters are spread across Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And she also mentioned that Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia, so you can see how pretty big that is. There is the two Apache tribes. These are located in Colorado. Here we have a picture of Geronimo, a powerful Apache hero. We also have the two Ute tribes, which are in Colorado. I'm sorry, I think I got them mixed up. The Apache tribes are in New Mexico, and the Ute tribes are in Colorado. I'm sorry. They're considered to be part of New Mexico because they are a part of what's called the IHS Albuquerque area tribes, which is seen here. These include all the tribes, nations, and pueblos considered to be a part of New Mexico as shown here. This doesn't include the Navajo Nation, however, but just to give you an idea of what tribes, nations, and pueblos there are in New Mexico. So I'm going to give you a personal perspective of my Pueblo history. As I mentioned earlier, I come from Santo Domingo Pueblo, also known as Kiwa Pueblo. My ancestors are come from they're the Anasazis. This is a picture of Mesa Verde, where my ancestors used to dwell long ago. But due to environmental changes like drought, we migrated to different areas further along the Rio Grande, which we live now today. We believe that everything has a spirit and should be respected as such. We believe in things like Mother Earth, Father Sky, and pray to spirits on a daily basis. We honor spirits through songs, dances, and prayers. We pray for everyone always before putting ourselves first. These acts ensure balance and harmony for the overall well-being of life. It is these spirits that link all things together. This balance was disrupted with the intrusion of the Spaniards. To re-establish balance, we merged Catholicism and the Pueblo culture together after many of the trauma we have experienced with the Spaniards. So that's why today many Pueblos are also Catholic and celebrate the merging of two cultures during feast days with their patron saint. Although my people have endured trauma from outside contact, we continue to stay strong through our adversity. We continue to practice with acts of honoring our spirits and beliefs as strength. That's why I'm here today. So I want to talk a little bit about Native American values. We have an emphasis on spirituality and respect. The land is sacred, everything is alive, and all things are equal. The relationship between these things, the earth, people, animals, and the spiritual world, is important. Human beings are least important in the world. It is our purpose on this land to honor, respect Mother Earth and Father Sky. The community is tied together by familial relations and the family's commitment to it. The needs of the community always come first. Family comes first, the individual last. Adherence to these community values are reflected in individual beliefs, so they do vary according to each individual, but these are the general beliefs or values that we hold. One important value we hold is that children are sacred. Children are considered sacred beings. Native American people believe that children are gifts sent from the Creator. Everyone in the community has a responsibility to raise and teach them so that they can become what the Creator wants them to be. From the first breath of life they take, children are surrounded by love. Abuse and neglect were never part of our traditions and were not tolerated. And just to mention, these two pictures are my boys. The oldest one is Nathaniel and the youngest one is Dominic. So I want everybody to take a moment to reflect and think about the values you have that are congruent with Native American values. So it's been about 15 minutes since I started, so if you're not eating lunch, take a little body break, which means standing up, stretching, and think about what you've just learned or what I've talked about. So we can take a moment to do that. Coming back, I want everyone to always remember that each tribe, nation, pueblo, native community is unique and should be respected as such. Each one that I have mentioned in my presentation have different languages, customs, traditional activities that distinguish each community. Moving on to objective number 2. We're going to go ahead and review the historical timeline. And I do want to offer a disclaimer. It is a touchy subject for some because I talk about the history, the past history, and it's very, it's not meant to offend, but inform you about the history as it has been passed on to me. So really getting to understand the client, we have to understand their history. Okay. So in about AD 1493, the Pope asserted the right to colonize, convert, and enslave. He authorized Spain to do that. So once he did that, they came, of course, across the continent, and our native people were exposed to these new people, the new Spaniards coming in, and when they came in, they were also exposed to different European diseases like measles, mumps, chickenpox, diphtheria, influenza, pneumonia, typhoid, and common cold, diseases that our bodies weren't immune to. So rapidly our people started dying, and this continued throughout our history. I want to mention the Zuni resistance. This occurred in the 1540s. The Spanish conquistador Francisco Vasquez de Coronado seeks the 7 cities of gold. And so Zunis killed, that was when he came. And when he came, he brought with him other conquistadors. And one of the conquistadors was Cabeza de Vaca. And he came into Zuni and started abusing the Zuni women. And when he did that, the Zuni men did not like what he did. And so they started to fight against the Spaniards that came in and started abusing Native women. And, to kind of, make the, not sure how to say this, he was under the authority of the Pope, right? So he recited the Requerimiento, which is an actual law from the Pope saying that he had the right to do that. And it's actually it's a justification and a demand for obedience. So he stated that to the Zuni people as they fought against him or retaliated against him because of the abuses his people were perpetrating against the Zuni women. But of course that didn't work. And because the men were so outrightly angry at the Spaniards for doing this to their women, they fought back, and unfortunately guns overpowered the Zunis while they only shot arrows. So I do want to mention that as, one of the important facts about history, that this was never a part of our tradition. We never, abused our women, and it was something that was never tolerated. So that was the Zuni resistance of 1540. In 1590, Spain attacks the Pueblos and established the colony at Okewingim. And that's just a little fact. It was kind of like the capital or the place where the Spanish people would all go and report back to. So they took over Okewingim, and that's where they established their colony. In efforts to kind of suppress the belief systems of the Pueblos, Spaniards raided and outlawed Pueblos' beliefs. They raided their kivas and burned all sacred objects. So this happened in 1661. The Pueblo Revolt, which I think many of you are aware of, occurred in 1680. And this was a revolt from the Pueblo people against the Spanish oppressors. The Pueblos were led by the religious leader Pope, 140 years after their arrival. So that was a very significant event for our Pueblo people. In 1824, the Office of Indian Affairs was established in the War Department. Why I mention this is because I think it clearly demonstrates the direction that the federal government was going in towards conquering Native Americans. So since it was established in the War Department, of course, it was meant so that they could go to war and kind of eliminate Native Americans across the country through war. So after they had that, they then, since they couldn't wipe us out, they moved it to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to the Interior Department. That means that now they decided that, they were gonna take our lands away, just what the Interior Department's for. To signal the change in approach they had, which moved from the war now to the Interior Department. So you can see the different approaches they were taking in attempts to eliminate Native American populations. Thus, in 1851, they created the reservations, which they forcibly removed many Native Americans from their homes and onto the East Reservation in attempts to manage Native American people. Another significant historical event was the Navajo Long Walk. It was the forced removal from the U.S. Army that drove the Navajo out of New Mexico or around the Four Corners at gunpoint as they walked from the homeland. So that happened in 1864. In 1879, the Carlisle Indian Boarding School opened. And, this was the onset of the boarding school era. And there are many atrocities that occurred during this time, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in my presentation later on. Of course, by about 1890, by the 1900s, Native American population plunged 95%, from more than 100 million to about 237,196. That's quite a decrease, but I think we should be proud that we are still here after all their attempts to extinguish us from U.S. So that was a very brief historical timeline. I hardly have given justice to it, but I encourage you to find out more about the history of Native people when you can. I have a very long, has so much more to talk about, so that's just a brief synopsis of it. But I do want to mention, to really drive it home, to talk about the history of Santa Fe. I'm sure maybe many of you are familiar with these pictures that I have put up. That's the Santa Fe Plaza, and of course the Santa Fe, the monument right across the plaza. I want to tell you a little bit about the history of this that was passed down to me from my mother. When the Spaniards initially entered New Mexico, they came upon Pueblo tribes, some of which were my people. They took my people as slaves and forced them against their will to build the Santa Fe Plaza. And when they, couldn't, they got tired due to lack of nutrition, food, or water, exhaustion. All of that would take them over and they would collapse and die. The Spaniards would tell the other slaves to proceed and continue to build over their dead bodies. So, I refer to it as the cemetery. It's my mom sells there daily, and she offers, prayers to our ancestors that are buried there. So instead, to honor our fallen people, our Native American people, what the Spaniards did is built a monument honoring them for the heroic battles they fought against the Native Americans in New Mexico, which is what the monument says. Notice that little scratched off marker right there after with, before Indians. This was recently taken down, like I would say in the late 1990s, and it used to read savages. And I remember as a little kid growing up, I would see that and I would think, what, are we savages? Is that what we are? Is that something that, and that's something that I saw, and finally, I think I was in high school by that time that, it was finally taken down. But, this was fairly recent, and, I think that's important to mention, that these things are still occurring in present day. Further, I want to talk about the history of the Santa Fe Fiestas, and you can actually go to their website. It's santafefiestas.com, and they talk a little bit about the history from their perspective, and they talk about the peaceful resolution, and it's a way to commemorate, the peaceful reoccupation of the city after they took over or reconquered the pueblos. This was, of course, after the Pueblo Revolt, and this is what they're celebrating. The fact that they reconquered the pueblos. And part of why we decided to this peaceful resolution. I would call it a forced peaceful resolution, because my people were tired. They didn't want to fight no more. They agreed to maintain the balance and harmony that I discussed earlier, and so we agreed to the merger of the two cultures. And of course, I do want to mention that it's not to make you feel bad, but I just want to share some of the historical history that was passed on to me. It's something that it's important to know. You can find more about that, of course, again, as I mentioned, and doing your own historical search. I really encourage you to do that. Excuse me. This leads into my next objective, which is to discuss historical trauma, now that I've given you a brief outline of the history. So what is historical trauma? The past trauma has left detrimental effects, trauma that continues to be transmitted intergenerationally. Dr. Maria Lahor's Bernhardt conceptualized historical trauma in the 1980s as a way to develop stronger understanding of why life for many Native Americans is not fulfilling, quote, the American dream, end quote. And according to her, this is her definition, it's a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from a massive group trauma. There have been many tribes that were ravaged, and brave leaders did everything humanly possible in the face of the ongoing march of European and American colonists across their land to protect their people and their way of life. Sadly, to little no avail, Native Americans eventually saw countless acts of violence perpetrated on their people and lands. Descendants of these early tribal leaders to this day suffer the adverse effects of historical trauma, and that grief is evident today. The events of historical trauma, how the U.S. government attempted to eliminate Native Americans from the United States was through extermination policies. And they're the manifest destiny policies, kill the Indian, save the man type of rhetoric. They accomplished this through the boarding school and they attempted to remove, and they did remove children from their homes and into these boarding schools, and they were reluctantly forced against their will, and when they didn't comply, a lot of the parents, and this was in the Southwest, they were sent to Alcatraz for refusing to send their Native American children to these boarding schools. So there was repercussions. If you didn't send your kids to boarding schools, you would go to prison. Those are some of the consequences. Of course, there's the forced relocation and removal from her reservations, and there's the urban relocation program, which I'll talk about more later. The broken treaties, promises made that were never kept. There's also the involuntary sterilization. In 1976, government admitted to forced sterilization of Native women. They concurred that 4 in 12 IHS hospitals have sterilized Native women. Imagine going into a hospital, for maybe a checkup and coming out sterilized, which is what was happening to these Native women who didn't know that they were, all they thought was that they were going in for a checkup and they come out sterilized. Imagine the impact of that on that woman. So the effects of these historical events, it can lead to things like unresolved intergenerational emotional trauma, depression, high mortality rates, serious health problems, high rates of abuse, alcohol abuse, child abuse, TV, and high suicide rates. And these effects all stem from how Native Americans have had to cope with this unresolved grief, and many are still in this grieving process. Domestic violence is one thing that was not learned, and it was not something that we had in our communities. It was something that was learned. We picked up the abuse that was handed down, and it's a form of coping mechanisms. Same thing with alcohol. Our bodies weren't used to the alcohol. It was something that our bodies just weren't used to these new substances, as well as the food that were high in fat content and carbs. I mean, it's kind of like, imagine being taken away from your home. The environment, what your mom cooks for you on a daily basis, your parents or your wife, whoever. Imagine being taken away from that and, forced to adopt something that, you didn't agree with. That's kind of, feeling those effects. I really want you to start feeling that. So let's talk some more about this grieving process. There's 6 phases of historical grief, and this is according to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. The first one is first contact, life shock, genocide, no time for grief. It's a colonization period, which involves the introduction of diseases and alcohol traumatic events. This is similar to what happens in maybe some of the women that you've come across in rape situations. They have no time to adjust, when the rape happens right away. So they're often, in shock. So this is phase 1. Phase 2 is economic competition or sustenance loss, removal of lands from their homeland. And I mentioned earlier about, have you ever left home and missed the food your mom made, the comfort of your home that you have always lived in and felt safe in? Imagine being permanently, removed from that and forced to adapt an entirely different lifestyle. That you lose and miss the food, the trust, that brings back the pleasant memories. They evoke that spiritual pleasure of who you are spiritually. That's phase 2. Phase 3 is the invasion war period. This is the loss of our native people. This picture reminds many people of the Holocaust. It continues to linger in my mind. I did a presentation once where there was this a Jewish person sitting there, and she looked at it, and she had this shocked look on her face, and she said that, when I looked at that immediately reminds me of the Holocaust. And so for her, that was a trigger for her. And so, I really want you to think about how this relates to other cultures as well, and how other people have had to go through the same, they have had the invasions, they've had the war period. So that was phase 3. In phase 4, this is the removal of the Native American from their lands onto reservation. They experienced the forced dependency of the oppress on the oppressor and the lack of security. They could not protect their Native women and children because, they had these men that were watching over them with the guns, weapons, that were superior to theirs. Phase 5, which is the boarding school period, destroyed the family system. The beatings, rape, prohibition of Native American language and religion has lasting effects, leading to parents being not prepared for parenting and identity confusion. I do want to mention that there were some positive experiences for some Native people that were placed in boarding schools, and that's okay too. But a lot of people, they came back and they were, they really had the loss of identity. They didn't know who they were, and they went to the boarding school. They developed this new lifestyle. When they went back, they were unable to adjust to their home life because they had lost their language and religion and practices. They didn't know how to do it because they were taken away at a very young age, and so it was hard for them to reintegrate into that. And so some of them will come back into the urban life or wherever the boarding school city where they came from, and kind of just live there. And of course, they will adopt some not unhealthy coping mechanisms like drinking, and which just destroyed who they were. Phase 6 is the forced relocation and termination period, and I mentioned a little bit about the urban relocation program, which is promises made from the federal government for jobs. But once they moved, they told them that if they moved from the reservation into an urban location, that they would provide them with jobs, stipends or whatever. And so they did. And some of these people, they didn't get that. They didn't get the job. They didn't get money. They didn't get they didn't get what they needed to survive in an urban area. They also experienced racism, and they just did not fit into that new world. They also could not practice, their religion. There was the racism, again, being viewed as second class, and the loss of government system and community. They didn't have their family there when they relocated to this urban city. So it's these phases, that contribute to the historical dream. Objective 4, identify. Well, we're going to begin to identify how history has shaped who we are today.
There's a comment if you're
David, are you still there?
I'm still here. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, good.
Am I still on?
You're still on. I don't want you to feel
I am, right?
like you're
okay.
alone out there in the internet. Here's a comment and question from Lisa. I was a U.S. history major and was never taught any of this history in either high school or college. How can we demand that the history of Native peoples be included in American public school curricula?
I think I mentioned a little bit, and I can answer that question actually towards the end of my presentation, where I do talk about the macro level changes we can begin to make as DV advocates, including things like advocating for policies and laws, and I think it's a great idea. I think it's something that needs to be taught in our schools. I think it's really needed because I wasn't taught myself this history in the school system that I went to. Of course, it was something that was taught to me through my family and through my community, but it was something never taught in the school system. So I think that's a great idea, and maybe going to school boards and advocating for that. And I would highly encourage that, even getting on parent advisory committees to kind of push that agenda. think that's something that we could take, the little steps we can take to accomplish the bigger goal of implementing it into the public schools. Okay, is there any more questions you want me to answer now?
Not at the moment. I'm still hanging on to the other ones. I think they'll,
okay,
in the next section they'll match.
Okay. So, identifying how history has shaped who we are today. And, and again, historical trauma, this unresolved grief, contributes to the current social pathology of high rates of suicide, homicide, domestic violence, child abuse, alcoholism, and other social problems among American Indians that I mentioned earlier. And kind of to give you a perspective of how this is still happening today, is I want to talk about this mascot issue that's been in the news. I don't know if many of you have been following this, but I think it contributes directly to the violence perpetrated against Native women. I mean, the mascot issue is related to control. When you can verbally call someone by the color of their skin, the Redskins, it sets up this hierarchy, establishes inferiority. For example, we used to have this word, and it's a word I don't agree with, but we used to call mentally or cognitively impaired people retarded. Why do we make that decision? Because it was offensive to the person. I think you can take that, and it's the same situation. I mean, the Redskin situation, think about it. It's that this verbiage sets the stage for where you are on the pecking order. President Obama recently commented on this. I don't know if many of you watched this, but this was, I think it was Saturday. He stated that if he were the Redskins owner, he would think about changing the name. A representative of the Oneida Indian Nation, Ray Halbritter, also commented that any other ethnic group would not tolerate this kind of language being used about them, and that's so denigrating and dehumanizing. I really want you to think about, how on a macro level, how these things relate to violence against Native women. In this situation, it's about control and verbally calling someone names, setting them up in the hierarchy, much like when a perpetrator talks down to a victim. And I want you to think about that. So moving on, let's identify some more disparities and barriers in the Indian country. This is according to the 2012 New Mexico Department of Health Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities Report Card. American Indians have the highest and worst rates for these diabetes, alcohol-related homicide, motor vehicle deaths, pneumonia, influenza, adult and youth obesity, late prenatal care, and youth suicide. This actually, I compared this to the other ethnicities listed on the report card, and of course we have the longest list, so it's not something to be proud of, but I think it demonstrates how much help we need as Native Americans in these issues. I think it's something that now again, I don't want you to feel bad. This history, me telling you about history disparities and current realities, but to help you understand so that you can begin to recognize and understand the issues that Native Americans face so that you can empower the Native American clients you work with. I think we can all work together to develop culturally relevant solutions so that we can heal and transcend from this trauma. I believe in humanity and the general kindness of people. I would say I'm a Rogerian at heart. I don't know if many of you know what that means, but It's having empathy and unconditional positive regard and genuineness in your interactions with people every day. And I think it's something we can all work on to eliminate domestic violence from communities together, from all communities. So that's, something to think about. On a brighter note, here's a picture of a baby stating, "Am I healthy?" A possible solution, and what we all want for our children, is a healthy environment. A healthy environment often consists of no worries or concerns about food, health, being healthy, having adequate exercise, and a loving partner to help guide you in the parenting process or raise that wonderful child, which leads to happiness and peace for everyone. And it's something that I think we can all agree on that we want for our children. I do want to mention the adverse childhood experiences. This study has demonstrated how adverse childhood experiences has a strong graded relationship to numerous health, social, and behavior problems throughout a person's lifespan. So ideally, we want that healthy child, but when children experience adversity, it's hard for them to maintain the healthy child. So I want to mention this because I want you to think about how, the Western society has identified how the past affects the present, much like historical trauma continues to affect Native Americans today. There is also the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence. It's a polyvictimization exposure to multiple types of trauma. And this is another important document in talking about childhood trauma and the ramifications of it. I would direct you to their website, but of course all federal programs websites are unavailable because of the lapse in federal funding. So I can do that, but it is through the Office of Justice program. So when they do come back on, you can look that up and find out more about this polyvictimization exposure and the impacts it has on children. And it's the same impacts that ACE has on children. When I mention ACE, I talk about things like when children experience domestic violence in the home, when they're living with an alcoholic parent, when they have gone through divorce or a death of a parent, when they've experienced child abuse, they've experienced child neglect, or when they've experienced sexual abuse. So it includes all those components. And that's what ACE kind of shows, like if you experience those things, you're at higher risk for developing negative health outcomes later on in life. Some of the barriers that get in the way of offering assistance to Native American communities is geographic location. For example, domestic violence that occurs on rural locations where Native people live, they often go underreported because they're unseen and unheard by witnesses. They're unable to have access to the resources that are available in urban communities because they can't get there. There's a transportation issue. Now, yes, in Santo Domingo we have the rail runner, which you can access, but many tribes don't have that resource available. They don't have any way to get to a domestic violence agency. There's a lack of education about what domestic violence really is, in the communities. Maybe the victim doesn't recognize what it is herself, and it's something that she's just used to. Maybe it was passed down generationally to her. And I think it's really important for us as DV advocates, to get out there and educate people, continue to educate people no matter what. There's also the racial prejudice. People just don't understand, and I really believe that when people don't get educated on certain things, they remain ignorant. This ignorance leads to racial prejudice, racism. And taking the time, and I really want to commend everybody for being on this presentation, because you begin to understand what it is that Native people go through or experience. There's also the stereotypes, and I think you can tell a lot of that in the mascots. The Redskins, the Chiefs. There's some the stereotypical headdress that people glamorize all the time. Cultural appropriation type of activities. There's community norms or culture, things that were passed down historically from the colonizer that some communities may have developed. It includes things like maybe keeping the family safe. You want to protect the community, and when a victim speaks out against it, sometimes they're blamed, and it's something that I'm gonna probably get a lot of negative feedback for saying, but I think it's something that needs to be acknowledged, that yes, we have these wonderful community values about how we keep the community kept together and we remain whole together, and how we do that is by staying together. And unfortunately, sometimes that works against the victims, and because they don't feel comfortable speaking out against the family, and because they want them to stay together. So and again, it's not just seen in Native American communities, but other communities as well, other racial groups. There's a mistrust that we have against non-native people, that when they come in to help us, what they've done is the helicopter approach. They come in, take whatever they need, and then they leave. That results in more mistrust, more so associated with the historical trauma that I just talked about. There's a lack of awareness. And I mentioned that when I talked about DV, and then law enforcement, tribal communities. Some communities don't have that. In Santo Domingo, we have tribal officials. They aren't law enforcement per se, but they act as law enforcement in controlling, what goes on in the pueblo. And there's only two that are on patrol for there's about 5,000 people in Santo Domingo Pueblo. So you can begin to see the lack of resources we have.
And maybe this question fits in now to this slide. Martha asked how many shelters are located in the reservations. She asked that about an hour ago.
Okay. Let's see. I actually have a list of some of the. No, I don't.
And I think
there's 8 northern. Some domestic violence agencies who serve Native women is located in the back of my PowerPoint presentation, so we can go over that later. But there are some shelters that are made available to Native American people. I know that Zuni has a shelter. Let me see. Laguna has a shelter. So yeah, I do cover that in the end, but just to mention a couple for now.
Yeah, great.
So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna try to rush through as much as I can. But I want you to remember that history has shaped who we are, and history, starts with an awareness and getting an understanding of Native culture. This includes an immersion into Native American culture. Go visit Native American Pueblo, go, you know, build relationships with Native American people that you know. You know, and we'll talk about more about how to engage with tribal communities later on. But I want you to begin to start thinking about that. So right now, as a body break, another body break, I want everybody to get up and kind of stretch, take a deep breath. It's an hour into my presentation. So I'm about a third of the way in my presentation. So to continue, let's define tribal sovereignty. It's another important thing to understand. This is meant to be a little bit funny, but tribal sovereignty is no laughing matter, but I think this adequately demonstrates how little people know about tribal sovereignty and what it is. Our president didn't even know what it was when he was asked what it was. And so another poll that I have for you is, what is tribal sovereignty? Go ahead and answer that question in your polling thing.
Okay. And the full answers I couldn't type in the full answers. So you might want to read this quickly first. So D is George W. quote.
Yeah, that's his quote. Okay, so A is a type of cake. B is inherent authority of indigenous tribes to govern themselves. C, a legal obligation under which the U.S. has charged itself with moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust towards Indian tribes. Or D, tribal sovereignty means it's sovereign. I mean, you're being given a sovereignty and you're viewed as the sovereign entity. That's George Bush's quote.
Okay, so I'll launch the poll here. All right, here we go. It looks like everybody is choosing number 2, number B. Oh, somebody chose the third one, a legal obligation.
Okay.
95% say inherent authority of indigenous tribes.
Okay, so that's very good. Actually, people are aware of what tribal sovereignty, and it is B. You know, I do want to mention that C is a part of it. You know, tribal sovereignty is the relationship between the United States, includes the relationship between the United States and the Indian tribes. It is based on and built around the doctrine of trust responsibility, which means there is a government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and each federally recognized Indian tribe. It also means that the U.S. has that trust responsibility, which is C, to each tribal government that includes the protection of the sovereignty of each tribal nation. You know, so that yes, we are sovereign and that we have the right to govern ourselves, but the federal government has the obligation to provide us with that assistance. You know, they cannot. Tribal sovereignty ensures that any decisions tribes make with regard to their property and citizens are made with their participation and consent. So I want to talk about VAWA, Violence Against Women Act. This landmark legislation provides vital protections for all women, but it is especially important for what it does to help ensure the safety of Indian women. Now, thanks to the new law, tribes may exercise jurisdiction over certain crimes committed by non-Indians on their lands. This represents a giant step forward in our ability to hold perpetrators of domestic and dating violence accountable. So this ties into tribal sovereignty because sexual violence against Native women has connections to oppression, domination, power and control, tools that have been used against Native American communities in attempts to annihilate these communities. Supporting tribal sovereignty connotes supporting the right of the people to self-determination. Violence against Native women is perpetrated by efforts to diminish and deteriorate the inherent right to govern. So tribal sovereignty ensures, again, the decisions about tribes with regard to property and citizens are made with their participation and consent. Thus, supporting Native women means supporting tribal sovereignty. I think that VAWA and along with Tolowa Tribal Law and Order Act are both small steps in the right direction because of the lack of resources we have in the communities. Many tribes are unable to implement this in their communities. My community doesn't have any tribal judges. We don't have court hearings. We don't have a jail directly on the reservation. So implementing, for example, Toloa requires those things. So, it is a really great historical event for President Obama to sign this great bill into law. But the federal government needs to work on collaborating with these tribes to make this law alive and come to life, and really work for our people. Let's see. Moving on to Objective 8, we're going to dwell into reviewing ways to advocate for the Native American client. And these are just some general guidelines that most domestic violence advocates know about protecting domestic violence victims, and something that all advocates should know and do on a daily basis. So I'm not going to go over it too much because I'm running out of time. And this includes responding to disclosures of abuse, which include empathetic understanding, providing choices and referrals, and safety planning. Things that most advocates are aware of. I wanted to mention a little bit about the DV triangle. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the battery and unnatural power and control triangle, but it's an amended version of the circle that we have. So I want to talk about 3 things on this triangle. The rest, I think pretty much of you know what it is, but I want to mention male privilege, cultural abuse, and ritual abuse. So male privilege is the belief enforced on female victims that a man has rights and privileges that are due to him simply because he's a man. The underlying assumption of male privilege is that women exist to gratify the needs of men who are somehow superior beings because they were born male. An example of exercising male privilege includes things like insisting she give him sex when he wants it, no matter how she feels, making her clean up after him, making him cook, clean, do whatever he wants for her. Moving on to cultural abuse. Cultural abuse exists against women because it has been condoned and accepted for centuries, such as male privilege through patriarchy. I can say this about my tribe, but Santo Domingo is a patriarchal society. Patriarchy societies often view women as having less value. It substantiates the belief that men are superior and women are subservient. Other examples of cultural abuse include practices condoned by culture, including female circumcision, rape in marriage, sexual slavery of honor crimes. And it can be an outcome of discrimination or racism. For example, your partner, the perpetrator using culture against the woman may be calling her offensive, using culturally offensive language, bullying based on the victim's culture, beliefs, or values, discrimination in activities not having equal contribution, dislike based on culture or background, and prejudice on what is being said. So these are all ways that the perpetrator can do cultural abuse. Lastly, ritual abuse or spiritual abuse is when someone uses your religious or spiritual beliefs to manipulate, dominate, or control you. This includes trying to prevent you from practicing spiritual or religious beliefs, making fun of spiritual or religious beliefs, forcing you to raise children in another religion or spiritual choice, or using your spiritual or religious beliefs to manipulate, dominate, or control you. I think these are all important issues that I've raised that are, they're very relevant in tribal communities, and it's something that, all DV advocates should be aware of. And it's another tactic that, is used on Native women. So let's move on. And how can we advocate for the Native women? On an individual level, we can be familiar with their history. I mentioned to you today about some of the history, and I want you to go back and find out more when you have time. I'm willing to meet with anybody to just talk more about this as well. Understand the client using the trauma lens, and trauma-informed care is something that we talk about a lot, and really integrating that when you're working with Native American clients. You want to build, gain, and grow trust. This takes time. And I want to mention that it sometimes takes small incremental steps. You have to be patient. It's not going to be an overnight process. It may take 7 sessions before the client begins to trust you. It's going to take time. So understanding that is really important. And also, you want to celebrate little triumphs. Maybe celebrating having the client come to the first session. It's really great that she did. So really celebrating that and honoring the women for choosing to be there with you. Little things like that should be celebrated. On a macro level, and then we talked about implementing the history in the schools is important to advocate for. Another way you can provide advocacy for the Native client on a macro level is to understand the tribal government structures. Each tribal government that I've mentioned in my presentation, and again, I talked about the Pueblos, the Navajo, the Apache, the Utes. They each have their own tribal court, laws, codes, law enforcement, etc. Tribal government structures that you need to be aware of when working with the client, because eventually, you are going to work with the Native American community that he or she comes from. You want to also advocate for culturally appropriate policies. I know one of the things that that many Native American agencies do is they provide what's it called, cultural leave, because there are activities that Native Americans practice that need time to do, so they need that time to be able to practice their culture. So integrating that into your policy is one way you can advocate for that Native American client. And you also want to be aware of the Native American cultures. You want to be aware of legislative issues and laws as well on the state and federal level. Of course, knowing things about VAWA and the Toloa Tribal Law and Order Act. Let's see. Objective 9, identify culturally appropriate strategies working with Native communities. Working with Native communities, and I want to emphasize with Native communities, because research is something that I do as well. It's another hat I wear. I'm the Southwest Tribal IRB coordinator, and there has been many research that has been done in tribal communities with the lack of ethics and cultural sensitivity. So really emphasize working with Native communities. How you can do that is reaching out and connecting with Native communities. Inform them about your services and provide them with your resources. Maybe holding informational presentations on tribal lands, or going out there. Santo Domingo just had a resource fair that you could have. There's different ways to begin to build a relationship with the tribal communities. You want to be mindful of traditions and cultural norms of Native American clients when you're working with them. You want to be aware of those as well if you're going to be going into the community. Sometimes you need, I know in most pueblos, you need the governor's permission before you can go and do any type of outreach or work in the community. So going to the governor and telling them what you're doing there is important. You want to collaborate with different tribes and share your resources as well, not just focus on one individual tribe. I recommend hiring Native consultants or community liaisons to provide the outreach because Native Americans feel comfortable with Native Americans. And it's more, sometimes, in situations they actually prefer a non-Native, but most of the times, you want to provide them with that choice. They choose who they feel comfortable with. You also want to develop and adapt brochures or resources for tribal input. Some tribal communities do have a written language, so having that having your brochure written in their language would be really great way to interact with the community. Inside the Domingo we do not have a written language, but it's something that instead of having a written brochure, you can actually have the advocate go out and do the presentation verbally to the community. You want to develop safety protocols for Native American clients. How would that be amended? What kind of protocols do you have now, and how could you adapt those? You want to establish existing collaborative networks. Any kinds of Native American groups that are out there, you want to go ahead and join and partner with them, to just begin to build the relationship. And not a lot of what I'm saying is engage. You want to reach out and work with the Native communities. So I'm about to wrap up. This is recommendations and resources that I do want to mention. You want to start where the person is. I'm a social worker, so it's one of our beliefs is starting where the client is, and really understanding it from her perspective and not your own is important. And where she is developmentally, trauma-wise, you want to understand it and really meet the client more on their level. You want to develop rapport and build the relationships, as Cecilia was mentioning earlier, engagement. You go the outreach and tell them about your resources, because a lot of Native things, I said they have issues with transportation, and they don't have many of the some resources. I think it's really important for you to go into the community like them with that active engagement and outreach. Again, developing partnerships and being aware of the process, and that means like where they are, starting where the person is. You want to empower them. Empowerment relates to tribal sovereignty, and it's giving them the rights to be able to. I think one of the things that I think that tribal communities can partner with DV agencies is building the network of relationships where they can effectively work together to provide services to Native American clients, and it's something that I would really like to be seen done. Cultural sensitivity is really important. I think I want to thank you all again today for being or listening in on the webinar, because that's one step in being culturally sensitive. You want to follow through, and I mentioned earlier about the helicopter approach, about people coming in and doing work and leaving. You want to make sure you follow through and stick it out, and that's why relationship is really important. That's one of our values, as I mentioned. You want to continue to build and maintain the relationships even after the work is done. That's how you maintain those collaborative relationships. You want to, again, provide your resources as much as possible. Consult with colleagues, Native American colleagues. They can provide you with the information you need to begin to do this outreach. And you want to reflect. And this is something that, I want to emphasize. I want everyone to really take the time to examine your own behaviors and interactions in the way we communicate with and relate to our clients. Really begin to ask yourself, is the client engagement skills you have healthy or unhealthy? And maybe if they're not, you can begin to work on it, and that's okay. So these are just some of the domestic violence agencies in New Mexico serving Native women. They're the 8 Northern Pueblos, Peacekeepers ENIPC, which means 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council, Tiwa Women United, and the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. And I've listed their websites and their email address, and the coalition has a lot of resources on their website in terms of shelters. If you go to their page, you can find out more information about their shelters. I mentioned that Zuni and Laguna have shelters. And if you're interested in finding more about that, I can provide you with the resources once I find out more about it. Of course, I have to find out the actual phone number you can call or who to reach to get to that shelter, and I can provide you with that once I find that out. And I can send that to David, and he can pass it on to you. The domestic violence resources in Indian country, this is nationwide. These are resources that you can access from your home computer, your work computer, and you can go onto these websites and find out more about how domestic violence impacts Native American women. So these are really, really good agencies that work with the Native American women. And then lastly, I want to leave you with this message. The attempted destruction of Native culture has created an atmosphere in which violence directed against Native women is condoned, tolerated, or ignored. It really ties everything together, everything that I've been talking about from our history or values that we've adopted, or culture, how that ties into domestic violence and what it is today. So right now, I would like to ask each and every one of you to create an action plan. I want to thank everyone for their time and attention. I know this was really long and quick and dirty, but I think finding out more on your own time, and I'm willing to meet with more people to discuss this further if you like. You can email me, call me. My contact information is right there. I can discuss more with you